Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started so we don't waste any time from this wonderful presentations that we're having. So good morning. Thank you for coming in this rainy morning to this workshop on ecological momentary assessment in underrepresented populations with a particular focus on cognitive assessments. So my name is Elizabeth Munoz. I'm an assistant professor in human development and family sciences here at UT, and I'm happy to be moderating today's session. So this workshop is hosted by the Texas Aging and Longevity Consortium, the Center of Aging and Population Sciences, and the Center for Advanced Sociodemographic and Economic Study of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. I also want to make you aware of a workshop on this Friday that's related to today's workshop. It's the workshop called Challenges of Measuring and Assessing Cognitive Health in Diverse Populations. This will be, you can find more information in the CAPS website, but it'll start at 9 a.m. Pacific time or 11 a.m. Central. Okay, so I know that there are some students here, so I want to kind of start with giving you a brief overview of what ecological momentary assessment is before we have our speakers present on their areas of study. So ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, involves the repeated sampling of individuals' current behaviors and experiences in real time in the person's natural environment. This methodology does not typically rely on retrospective reports and assessing constructs in research or clinic visits, which may lead to less recollection bias and greater ecological validity, or that is, the ability to generalize observed behaviors to individuals' real-life situations. This type of methodology also tends to rely on remote and ambulatory technologies such as personal computers, smartphones, and wearable devices. And so with the growing availability of these technologies, this has really expanded this area of study. And so these methods really hold promise for the advancement of cognitive assessments of adults and may provide greater ecological sensitivity as cognitive function is being measured in people's everyday lives where individuals usually employ those cognitive abilities. This may also help detect early shifts or changes that may be indicative of later disease progression, which will help in the early identification of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. However, one question that does still remain is how we can make sure that this methodology is inclusive and it's reaching populations that tend to be underrepresented in cognitive aging research. And so our speakers today will provide insights into this. They are some of the leading experts in this field, and we're very grateful that they agreed to come and join us today to share their expertise with us. So we'll have Dr. Jason Hassenstab, who's a professor of neurology and psychology and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. We'll then hear from Dr. Raeanne, who's a professor of psychiatry at the University of California in San Diego. And last, we'll hear from Dr. Nelson Roque, assistant professor of human development and family studies at Penn State University. Some logistics, basically we'll hear from each of the speakers. They'll have about 20 minutes. And then after each talk, we'll have time for some Q&A. And after everyone's presentations, we've allotted more time so that folks can ask questions to all speakers, and we'll have a discussion from that. Okay, so without further ado, we'll have Dr. Hassenstab set up his presentation.
I have the mic in my pocket. Do I need to do something to it? You got it? All right, he's good. Thanks so much. Three things just to start out with before I pull my slides up. Great music. I used to be a jazz musician, so I appreciate the Kind of Blue album by Miles Davis that was playing. Second thing, I heard people complaining about the rain, and I heard some people say I'm from Florida. Well, I'm from Seattle, so I can especially relate. Um, and okay, let's see if I can find them here. That's not the one. This is it. Okay. And the third thing is, of course, I want to show you all on my disclosure slide because it's the most interesting part of my talk. No, it's not. My university requires that I put this up here, so nothing necessarily conflicting for today, but I just want to make sure this is known. So I'm going to talk a little bit about EMAs in the cognitive sense, and I am a clinical trialist. I'm a neuropsychologist, cognitive psychologist, really, because I haven't done clinical practice in 12 years. And also that picture of me was from 12 years ago, too, when I first joined the faculty. So a little bit of a surprise there. But I study Alzheimer's disease. I have a technology lab at WashU, which is called the Cognitive Technology Research Lab. And we develop assessments, typically mobile assessments and web-based assessments, smartphone assessments for clinical trials mostly, and also observational studies in Alzheimer's disease. But I focus on two really unique samples of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how we develop this platform for global reach. So it's not just underserved populations for us, but it's like getting this out globally and making a true international study. That's what we do. And I'll give you a localization example of how we validated our verbal memory task. Then I'm going to talk about a population of people that's usually not included in the underserved label, but I think they should be, and that's people with disabilities, specifically people with intellectual disabilities. And I'll tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing now to develop our Down syndrome associated Alzheimer's disease study. And I'll tell you a little bit about considerations for developing measures within this really special and unique population. So just to start off, back in 2017 or so, we started building a smartphone application for a global phase 2-3 clinical trial to prevent the advancement of Alzheimer's disease, basically to slow the disease down in people who have a genetic mutation for Alzheimer's disease, which typically causes the disease onset at a very, very young age. Around age 45 is the average age of onset. I'm 40. It's very strange to sit across from someone who is my age who has dementia. Now it's really on. Okay. So that's the Diane study, or the Diane Trials Unit study. The requirements for this one back in 2017, we wanted to use a native smartphone application. This was really important to us because we could fully use it offline. And I'll tell you a little bit about why that is in just a second. Another thing that was really important to us was that we built this from the beginning, from the ground up, to be used in different cultures. I'm not a big fan of taking an existing test and translating it and just saying, took care of that. That rarely works well. We have to do it sometimes because our precedent or our gold standard measures are like that, but I didn't want to do that this way for this study. So this is the Diane study internationally. We have something like 40 or 50 sites around the world. And you can see there's a heavy population in North America and Europe, but there's also a lot of other sites that are in some very, very rural places, especially our sites in Central and South America. We have 2 sites in Mexico, Puerto Rico, and a very, very rural area of Colombia. So that's why I wanted to have like this offline capability. This is going back to like 2016, 2017, because I was worried about access and having mobile access out in these rural areas. And so I wanted to make sure that people could use our app to measure cognition. And then when they were in service, they could upload it. Turns out this was all for nothing, because some of the people that we serve in these areas may not have power at their home. They may not have electricity, but they all have cell phones. And there's actually very good coverage, even in many of these very, very rural areas. So we've sort of backtracked on that a little bit, just as an interesting sidebar. But I just wanted to show you that this is a very, very international study. So when we developed all of these measures, we had to really focus on this as a primary factor. This is what we do. I'm not going to go over EMA because Liz just did such a nice job of introducing what it is. But we basically tell people, okay, between the hours of, this is just an example, of 7 to 10, there are 3 different tests that are going to pop up on your phone that you have to take. and each symbol represents what they are, which I'll explain in just a minute. This looks like a lot of testing, right? But each one of these interactions is less than 3 minutes. So this goes very, very quickly for people. And we actually measured pickups just passively in a different study. And the average time that you sort of like pick up your phone and check it when you're not like in a long session of Duolingo or whatever, you know, you like where you're involved in your phone, or with Reels, it's probably changed now because Reels are so addictive. But about the average interaction time is about 3 to 5 minutes for people when you just like pick it up, check your email, check a couple social media posts and put it down. So we kind of wanted to mimic that scenario of just like a quick pickup, you know, take your cognitive tests or other assessments, put the phone down and walk away. That's what we were working with. I'm going to show you just some of the tests now. We chose items that we think work in every single culture, and this is like really, really difficult to do, to pick common items. This is a spatial working memory task. So we picked a key, a smartphone, and a pen, and we have a bunch of other items that we think exist in pretty much every culture that we work with. This is just one way to deal with cross-cultural neuropsychology. There are many others, but this is just one way. They complete a distraction task, and then they have to remember the items. No big deal, right? Then we did an abstract symbols task, which I basically copied from my very good friend and colleague, Marty Slawinski, who I think is going to talk to you guys on Friday. And this is actually our best performing test, and people actually really enjoy this, which I was shocked by. So we picked abstract symbols. They just have to match the one on the bottom that matches one of the 3 on top. And there's 12 of these. This test takes like 30 seconds. It just blazes by, and people really enjoy it. But the one I wanted to talk to you guys about today was how we developed a verbal memory test for global smartphone administration. So there's a bunch of things we had to think about. Whenever you have any sort of list or sort, I want you to remember these things. If the items are odd or unfamiliar, like cognitively, that makes them more salient. You know, they're going to be more memorable than the other items, and so you're going to get all sorts of weird things on your lists. Another thing we have to think about is like auditory presentation. Even though it's gotten much, much better, it's still really, really difficult to do for ambulatory studies because you might be in a noisy environment, you know, and nobody wants to like hold a phone up to their ear, and you just can't control those things as well. So we couldn't do that. Free recall is really, really difficult to standardize, especially with typing on a phone, and there's just all sorts of problems with that. And then for repeated administration, we obviously needed to have some alternate forms. Otherwise, the test would become like a rote memorization test, which is not a spontaneous measure of episodic memory, which is what we were going for, which is probably the most important outcome in an Alzheimer's disease study because it's a disorder of memory, right? So we also wanted to make sure this was clinically meaningful, and this is really, really important for randomized controlled trials because when your study gets scrutinized to say, well, okay, your treatment is effective or not, you've got to show something that's clinically significant and also clinically meaningful. Like if, you know, my symbols test gives us beautiful data, but, you know, neurology type regulator people are just going to be like, what is that? How does that translate to real world environments? Well, everybody shops, right? So that's where we were going with this task. So we ended up with a paired associates task called prices, where we asked people to make shopping and price comparisons. This is a mostly universal construct. Every single culture on the planet, pretty much, not everyone, like does this. So we could localize the items, so we could localize the currency to make it more familiar and meaningful for people. And we use an item bank to generate nearly endless forms. So there's not like a rote memorization. It's still a spontaneous episodic memory task. And then we used realistic prices. And we run into some trouble here with older adults, not so much with the younger people, but older adults will be like, I'd never pay $8 for blueberries, you know, and they get totally fixated on that. But they get over it because in EMA studies, you see it so often that those types of effects that really affect your study, that impact your study right away, tend to wash out over time. My former postdoc, Andy, who's now an assistant professor with us, helped develop this paradigm. So here's how we did this. We have 60 seconds. They're randomly generated alternate forms. There's adequate range, no floor ceiling effects. These are what we were saying is a successful development of a task. It can be completed by people with early symptomatic Alzheimer's disease. Engagement ratings had to be high, although on a memory test, that's hard to do because nobody likes taking memory tests. I got news for you. As much as we make them attractive, people do not like getting their memory tested. And the reliability must exceed 0.9. And that's an arbitrary number, but I like the sound of it, and it seems to be like, gives us really good data. So here's what we iterated on to sort of tune this task this way. We messed around with item price pairs, between 6 and 12 of them. We varied the presentation, so like how long they could study the item, from 1 second up to 3 seconds. We added evaluation judgment, you know, is it a good price or is it not a good price, just to increase engagement. And then we messed around with a number of alternative choices. Then we also messed around with the price difference options, because it turns out if the two prices that you're asking about are very similar, the test gets really hard. But if the two price options are like $1 or $9, it gets way too easy. So we messed around with this. We probably tested 2,000 people online, you know, to come up with our final version of this test. So that's great. We got a great test in English that measures associate memory. But how do we do this for each culture? This was the biggest part that we had trouble with, but we did come up with a solution that I think worked pretty well. So what we did is we identified locals, and these are usually people at our sites from the map that I just showed you. And I said, hey, give us 75 or 100 items that people shop for every day in your culture. We had 5 people do this from each culture. And the items have to be familiar and, you know, so that people could recognize them in each country. Then we had a different set of locals actually look at those lists and rate them on familiarity and relevance. So they gave it a Likert scale just really quickly. They would just look through the list. And we did all of this, by the way, using Qualtrics software. It's like very, very fast and easy to do. And then finally, we ranked all of those items based on familiarity and relevance, and you come up with like a final list. And this becomes your item bank. So we did this for, I think, 26 or 22, I can't remember, different cultures. It, you know, took about 2 months to get everybody to actually respond and do everything, because you're sort of borrowing people's time. But then we ended up paying people to do this online, and they were very happy to do it when we got valid answers, and it worked pretty well. So this is, I just picked the Dutch version of this for this talk, but I believe this is something like toothbrush, and that's like maybe strawberries or something. I can't remember. If anyone speaks Dutch, feel free to correct me. But this is what we ended up with, was 10 item price pairs, 3-second presentation, and then our primary outcome was errors. And we got pretty good data from that. So I need to go faster here because my time is going down quick. But some other considerations that are really, really important for making your measures global. So older adults use smartphones, and we published a paper on this, but they still lag behind younger adults, and there's a huge familiarity effect that goes on. But we can absolutely teach older adults to do these tests. We have a participant who's 101 in our study who had never used a smartphone before age 98. Up to 85% of older adults own smartphones, but it varies by age and race. 80% of white households have broadband, but it's less than 70% in Black and less than 65% in Hispanic households. I don't know how much that's changed. That data is a little bit old. And the other thing is that app stores there's no Google Play Store like in places like China. It's banned. So you have to distribute your app like through different means. It can be very, very difficult. And the last one is a little bit relevant still, but Wi-Fi is a big problem in rural communities. The other thing is that Androids are a lot less expensive, so you have to sort of think about interoperability. How well does your task work on iOS and Androids? For example, in South America, it's up to 90% of the market. I'm going to skip this for now because I want to make sure I get to my other part. So I talked a little bit about how Down syndrome and people with disabilities are usually not included in discussions of underserved populations, and I think they should be. You know, I don't know, maybe your center is different, but I almost never see this when it's discussed. And this is something that I got into in the last 3 years. I was actually approached by the Down syndrome community and said, hey, would you like to do something? Because we desperately need some way to study Alzheimer's disease in our population. And I knew nothing about Down syndrome. I still know very, very little about it. But we ended up getting a grant funded to run this study. So just a little background on Down syndrome, just one slide. If you're not familiar with it, they have an extra copy of chromosome 21, which is also called a trisomy. And it's a genetic form of Alzheimer's disease because it has a very, very young age of onset typically. So the amyloid precursor protein is located on chromosome 21, and that causes your brain to produce amyloid, your body to produce amyloid. When you have an extra copy of that, you're producing more amyloid than people who don't have this. And amyloid is one of the two primary proteinopathies in Alzheimer's disease. The other one is tau. In people with Down syndrome, AD pathology is evident in their brains by about age 40, and almost everyone becomes symptomatic by age 50, 55, and by age 65, almost 100% of people with Down syndrome have Alzheimer's disease. Did people know that everybody with Down syndrome had Alzheimer's disease? Anyone know this? A couple of people. Most people don't, but almost all of them get Alzheimer's disease, and is the #1 cause of death in people with Alzheimer's disease by a mile. It's like 75% of deaths in Down syndrome are from Alzheimer's disease. So people with Down syndrome are routinely excluded from AD studies and clinical trials. So why? Well, the FDA and the European Medicines Agency, also called EMA, which I didn't want to put up here for obvious reasons, require evidence of cognitive benefit to approve any treatment, whether it's a drug or, a exercise therapy or some non-pharmaceutical intervention. You have to show cognitive benefit. And that's tough to do in a Down syndrome population because it's confounded by intellectual disability, right? And the typical way that the FDA or these regulatory bodies look for outcome measures is they compare them to what's known. And what they know are like the Wechsler memory skill, memory test, the California verbal learning test. They're used to these very, very structured classic neuropsychology paradigms. And these don't really exist in the Down syndrome population. They basically have a pretty loose collection of tests, mostly intended for screening. They're basically derivatives of the mini mental state examination, if you're familiar with that. And so it's kind of a big missing niche thing that I thought would be great to study. And none of these, of course, are developed specifically for global studies. So everything is like a translation, usually of an English version that was developed for a neurotypical population in North America, a long time ago. So you can see you were kind of starting from totally scratch here, which is great for me as someone who gets excited about developing tests, but harder to do. So can we adapt our tool for Down syndrome studies? So we developed the Ambulatory Research and Cognition Down syndrome study. And the overall aim of this is to develop a digital cognitive and functional assessment platform for global. And I underline that here because it's really important. As you can see, we actually currently only have one site in the United States. And the others are mostly in Europe, one in South America. And I'm really excited because it's still under review, but we are hoping to add a site in Johannesburg in South Africa if we get funded to do this, which I think we will, but we don't know yet. So I'm really excited that this is reaching global proportions. And as the PI of this study with 500 people, this has totally changed my life into like much more of an administrative role. But hey, that's what the gray hairs are for. Okay, so what do we have to think about with this population, which is very, very underserved? Well, we have to make whatever software, whatever thing that we build suitable for individuals with mild intellectual disability. There's a huge range of function in people who have Down syndrome. So we had to sort of limit it to people who were on the upper end of the intellectual disability scale. So in the mild intellectual disability range. Why? Because it's really hard to interpret outcomes. And if the drugs or therapies or whatever work in that population, it should apply to everybody that has Down syndrome AD. So they can't read usually. It's only about 10% literacy level. It's actually hard to find a statistic on this, but this is just me asking my colleagues who are experts in Down syndrome. Then of course we have multiple languages and cultures, probably the hugest factor. And speech impairment is common. So ASRs don't work in this population. Automated speech recognition doesn't work in this population because they have enlarged tongues and narrow throats and sometimes very heavy cheeks. So they're part of the genetic phenotype in Down syndrome. So you can't use automated speech recognition. Visual impairment is also common. And they often require assistance from a study partner with technology, to remember to charge the device if you're using a device. Although from what I hear and from our pilot studies, it's actually very hard to take the devices away from people with Down syndrome because they enjoy using them so much. But that's kind of what we're up against. So really quickly, I'm almost done, Liz, I promise. Here is our original symbol search test. And what we've had to do is simplify it into a single choice. And then we also include audio because you can't just give a bunch of text instructions, right? So now it has to turn into an audio task, which raises a whole bunch of other challenges for an ambulatory study, obviously. And then we're also moving it to a tablet option for people with visual impairment, even though most people with visual impairment just wear glasses. I mean, people always bring this up in my studies of older adults. They can't see the phone. Well, how many older adults do you know that don't have readers? Like none. They all have them, you know. In every country, they have them. They pop them on and they use it. But so we did this, and it has to have audio instructions. We simplified our prices task down significantly. We include pictures, and we simplified the prices down into like a 2-digit price, although price comparisons are really difficult for people with Down syndrome. They don't quite get the concept always. Like I said, there's a big range. Some people have almost normal intelligence with Down syndrome, and there's other people who have much more difficulty with this task. So this one is not working out fantastically, and I'll show you some data in just a second. And then we also simplified our grids test down. We made the grid smaller, we added audio, and if they touch the correct pictures, it makes a sound, which is giving them a little bit of an affirmative response. And this one was actually very popular with our participants thus far. And these are some data. We just have 23 people enrolled now. I know I said there's 500, but we got funded in September. So we only have 23 people enrolled thus far. So the shapes test, which was just that simplified version of symbols, is giving us beautiful data exactly like we would think. And you can see like the correct level is right where we want it to be. However, the prices test is a little messy. And so we're working on another iteration of that actually removes the price comparison. And we have like a 3rd and 4th test planned that we are really, really excited to get developed now. And I'm going to stop there. I have a couple other things, but I'm over time. So I just want to thank a few people. My former postdoc, who's now an assistant professor with us, my unbelievable postdoc, Jessica, who got snatched up by Apple, and I'm still mad at them for that, and my current postdoc, Matt, who's actually joining our faculty. I just want to acknowledge them, and of course our participants and families. And I'm going to end there, and I still put the bird on the Twitter app. I refuse to put the X, but please reach out to me. I'm very, very happy to collaborate or answer any questions that you might have about Alzheimer's disease clinical trials or developing these for international studies. Thanks very much. Hello.
Every single point you made. So mostly I just wanted to stand up and say that. But I also was curious because you mentioned that you managed to get like 2,000 people help you do things. And I'm wondering like how you get, we've had some problems with bots recently and things. So I'm just wondering so tell us.
Sure. First of all, thanks for the compliments. Please continue. Second, we started off with MTurk, like everybody does, Amazon's Mechanical Turk worker population. And yeah, we were getting like absolutely bananas data. We were able to identify people, and I'm looking at Nelson because he knows all about this too, and probably Raeanne, you probably do too. But we were able to identify like the clicker people. They were just like, tick, 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 click, through, yeah, give me my money, click, 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 click. And then we also found some striking resemblances between different users. So we think they were signing in with different accounts. And so we quickly went to a different platform called Prolific, which was actually much better. And then we found another one which services European populations called ClickWorker. And they screen their participants a little bit better, but we still have about 10-15%. I'm just curious what you guys think that we have to just throw out because we just can't interpret it. Would you say it's about 10 or 15%? Yeah, that's Nelson knows a lot about this too. So we have a bunch of data that we just have to toss, But what we would do is we would run those pilot studies with 50 people at a time, and we would often do an A version, a B version, and a C version, and start them simultaneously. And you can do all this, and you get data back like in a day. Like it's pretty incredible. Yeah, you're going to lose 10 or 15% of it if you can identify the people who have multiple accounts or the people who are just burning through the tests as quick as possible. And there's all sorts of other tricks and ways to trip people up during the middle of it. Like we require little attention checks, in the middle of it. And if people just burn through those questions, we just like throw their data out. But it eventually got us what we needed just to get our psychometrics where we wanted it to be. Yeah. It's not easy, but there's all sorts of tips and tricks out there. I'm happy to share. Hi.
So for the spatial memory task, for researchers who are interested in implementing them in their own studies, is it proprietary to your group, or can researchers access that? How do we do that? And then for the Down syndrome game, do you think that's okay to use with normal population too, or only for cognitively impaired populations?
So great questions. Everything that I do is publicly available. It's on my GitHub pages. You can download our source code. I am not a very good developer, but my people that run these things for me are. We have a professional development company, and we maintain a GitHub, and everything is available. And I freely share all of my materials, test analysis scripts, whatever you like. The spatial working memory task, we have one for normal neurotypical populations. That was one of the first things I showed. And then we have the one that we developed for the Down syndrome as well. Great question.
Okay, we're going to have to move on, but you can speak to Dr. Hassenstab at the lunch after this. Okay, next we have Raeanne.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Raeanne Moore with the University of California, San Diego. And I'm a clinical neuropsychologist by training as well, but I do full-time research now. And since our other two speakers are talking about cognitive testing and an ecological momentary assessment platform, I decided to mix it up today, and I'm going to be talking about passive assessments we can use from smartphones to assess cognition. So yeah, I'm going to talk about passive digital assessments of cognition with a focus on Hispanic Latinos. I'm just going to refer to this group as Hispanics moving forward. And for my disclosures, I have co-founded a couple of digital health companies, NeuroUX, which is an ecological momentary assessment and mobile cognitive testing platform, as well as KeyWise AI, which I will be presenting some data from KeyWise today. So I'm going to spend a good chunk of my talk going over just recruitment and engagement strategies for passive digital biomarker research in this population. We take a culturally informed approach to recruitment and retention, and so I'm going to share some tips and tricks that we've learned along the way. And then also provide some preliminary data with a focus on the keystroke data as a digital biomarker of cognition in ADRD research. So before I dive into that, I just wanted to share a little about myself and my program of research. In addition to doing research with persons at risk for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, I also work with other cognitively impaired populations, such as persons with serious mental illness and persons with HIV-associated neurocognitive disorders. I've recently also begun collaborating with Dr. Ashley Hennigan, who's here at UT Austin, on cancer-related cognitive impairment. And overall, what I really am passionate about and love doing is creating and validating new tools for digital brain research, as well as using technology to just improve our diagnostic accuracy, track symptoms over time, and really see if we can identify digital biomarkers that can be used in clinical trials and for early identification. So my ongoing work, I engage with both active and passive data collection methodology. I'm wrapping up a 5-year R01 where we're using a virtual reality self-assessment tool as a cognitive screener. Also do a lot of work with ecological momentary assessment, mobile cognitive testing, which is something I love to do. And then in addition to that, I engage with passively collected markers, and these are mostly from smartphones and wrist wearables. I think it's important to use ubiquitous technologies, particularly smartphones, because as Jason was highlighting, pretty much everyone in the world has a smartphone. They may not have running water, but they're gonna most likely have a smartphone. And there are 26 sensors built into smartphones, so there's a wealth of information that you can explore using data just from these devices. We do work with speech samples, natural language processing, GPS as a marker of life space. I'm gonna be sharing some of the keystroke work we have and various other sensors in the phone. In addition to my research, I just wanted to highlight some of the other data streams that people in other cognitive health research are using and pulling from smartphones. There's just some really interesting work being done with just the way we interact with our devices on a day-to-day basis and how that can be kind of this little digital fingerprint of your own cognition. So I'm going to be sharing some recruitment strategies from one of my ongoing R01s. This is a multiple PI grant that I'm doing with Dr. Maria Marquine, who, when we started the grant, was at UCSD and now is at Duke University. We lost her, but we're trying to develop digital phenotypes of risk for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias among Hispanics. Hispanics are at increased risk for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, and particularly compared to non-Hispanic whites, we see higher incidence of mild cognitive impairment and cardiovascular disease risk, which are two very well-known risk factors and can hasten the progression to Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And these pathological processes begin many years before symptoms occur, but traditional methods for early identification of ADRD, such as traditional neuropsych batteries, imaging, lumbar punctures, all of these traditional methods just come with significant challenges, particularly cost and time burden. Oftentimes they aren't covered by insurance, and these challenges are pronounced among Hispanics. So our goal of this study is we're collecting all kinds of passively obtained data from smartphones and wrist wearables. We're giving everyone in our study a Fitbit, and we are requiring everyone to own a personal smartphone and engage with that smartphone on a regular basis. And then we're collecting all kinds of sensor-based data from these devices. From the Fitbit, we get physical activity and sleep. We're also getting heart-related information. And then from the smartphones, we're able to get social activity, so how often people pick up their phone throughout the day, how much time they spend on different apps, these different social variables. We're getting life space and location data from GPS. We're getting the keystroke data, and we're getting a measure of gait speed. And what we're doing then is we're going to apply machine learning algorithms to all this data to see if we can identify unique digital phenotypes of various risk factors for ADRD and related dementias. We're also factoring into account different sociocultural factors and different sex differences as well when we're doing this. The participants are being very well characterized in our lab, so they come in for a comprehensive neuropsych battery. They're doing a fasting blood draw. We're genotyping them for ApoE4. We're getting plasma-based biomarkers, and we're comprehensively assessing their cardiovascular disease risk as well. And we're using that lab data to validate our mobile data against. So overall, we're in the process of recruiting 300 Hispanics. It's a pretty narrow age range in this study, so people 50 to 70 years old, with and without mild cognitive impairment, as well as with and without CVD risk. So we're enrolling people in these 4 different groups, from having both impairment or risk factors to neither risk factor. We're bringing back a subset of those participants to complete 18 and 36-month follow-ups. We're not doing the full 300 because it was too expensive. So we're bringing back a subset of 90 participants. And this is just an overview of the study design. Nice visual for you to see here. So participants come to the lab for a baseline assessment. We install the apps on their phones. We give them a Fitbit. They do 30 days of digital data collection at home. They return to the lab. They return the Fitbit. They get compensated, do a little more testing. And then that process is repeated for the participants who are going to be coming back for the 18 and 36-month follow-up. So we've taken a culturally informed approach to recruitment. This is a difficult group to recruit. There's a lot of distrust in the community, distrust of the healthcare system, and distrust of privacy concerns with data. And so we've done a lot of different things to try to really break down these barriers to participation and engage with the community. One of the things that we've done is we have hired a fully bilingual, bicultural team, which is really helpful because then the participants can see that the staff, they speak their language, they share some cultural experiences with them, they look and sound like them, and they can relate to a lot of their life experiences. We also have 2 testing sites. One of our testing sites is at UCSD campus, but the UCSD campus is in a very affluent non-Hispanic white area in San Diego County. So we've partnered with another testing site closer to the Tijuana border, which has a larger Latino representation, and participants can go there for their visits, which makes it a lot more convenient. We also conduct home visits if participants prefer, and we have very flexible scheduling. Our staff is super great about coming in really early or staying late or coming on weekends to do visits and really working around these participants' schedules. So they're 50 to 70, so a lot of our participants are still active in the workforce, have childcare responsibilities. We do provide childcare reimbursement if needed. We provide transportation, we'll call lifts for the participants if needed, and we provide meals during all the study visits. We've also become actively engaged with the community. And becoming engaged with the community, we found we can't just go to a community organization and make an ask, say like, hey, can you help me recruit for my study? It really has to be this partnership. And so but we go in and we say, this is what we can offer you, and in return, would you help us with recruitment? And the things that we offer that people find very beneficial are, we offer to give talks on brain health and Alzheimer's disease and risk. We have like meet the doctor sessions. We'll do memory screening for these organizations. And that way we're really giving back to the community as well as getting something from them. One of our partnerships that's been the most successful is with a Mexican consulate in San Diego County. And they have monthly health fairs, and they let us go to the health fairs and have a booth. And we get a lot of the same people coming to the health fairs each month. And they don't sign up in the beginning, but over time they see our team there regularly. They start to develop a relationship, building trust with us and the community. And then we get signups and the snowball effect of people referring their friends and working that way. And this is a picture of my daughter last summer at one of the health fairs helping out. We've developed relationships as well with a lot of community collaboratives in the organization, which are just collaboratives of healthcare workers and mental health workers, and we provide psychoeducation talks to them, and then they help recruit for our study as well. Other recruitment efforts, actually one of the recruitment efforts that really has the most bang for our buck is flyer distribution. Surprisingly. But we really try to flyer in targeted parts of the community. So we go to Mexican grocery stores, other Mexican stores, coffee shops, taco shops, hitting up just neighborhoods that have higher population of Hispanics in those communities. You would think that churches would be a really high kind of bang for your buck recruitment source, but we have found that to not be the case. If we try to approach a church without being a member of the congregation, there's just kind of this distrust, who are you outsider coming in? But we did find one of our early participants, she's a member of a big church in San Diego, and she loved our study and went and told her congregation about it, and we got a lot of referrals that way. So it's really having that trust and connection. We also engage in various different media strategies. So we published a series of articles last year in the Spanish version of the San Diego Union Tribune, which is a print media as well as online newspaper. And these were just health education articles. We also do Facebook recruitment, which we haven't actually yielded any participants yet. We get a lot of interest and people just haven't been eligible, but it's really inexpensive. So thinking about your studies, you can post ads for $7 a week, and you are reaching a lot of a target audience, and then it's just a lot of screening through these folks. All of our materials also we provide in English and in Spanish, and we've developed a formal partnership with a promotora who is a community-based member who she gets paid per referral, and is someone who's really outgoing and out there in the community and has connections that we don't have as a research team. So those have all been helpful strategies. Another thing we do is we really want to make sure to return information that's valuable to our participants in the study. So we offer them the option to have their neuropsychological testing results returned to them. We'll write up a letter for them, and they can share that with their family members or their healthcare providers of their testing results. We'll provide their blood draw results to them if they would like. And some of our participants like to get their Fitbit results. They can see their 30 days of their sleep and their physical activity from that. So we're happy to write those up and provide graphs of that data as well. When they come to the visit, we also provide a lot of help, smartphone help. So as I mentioned, participants have to own a smartphone to be in our study. And we need to install these apps to collect our passive data streams onto the smartphone. And it's not just, it's passive, but it's really like less active. There's still things they have to do over the 30-day data collection period to contribute the data from these apps. So they have to open and hard stop some of the apps regularly. They have to, especially the GPS app, they have to sync the Fitbit to the app on the phone. They have to remember to charge their Fitbit and their smartphone. There's things that they have to be doing. And so the staff spends a lot of time with them, just making sure that they feel comfortable doing these things, know how to do all of this. And one thing that's wasn't part of the original protocol, but that we're finding participants love and is such a value add to them is we're helping them with all these other phone-related questions. So we kind of sometimes feel like an Apple Genius bar, but they're like, well, my son or daughter said I should be able to do this. I don't know, how can you show me? Or I'm out of memory, I can't take any more pictures. So we help them clear up their memory, or they need to update their operating system. And so this portion of the visit takes quite a bit of time, but is a value add to the participants as well. Then we don't just let them be on these 30 days passive data collection. We engage with them continuously throughout this period. We send reminder texts and calls. Our staff is also available for tech support, phone calls and video calls. And we do home visits sometimes for tech support. Sometimes they actually accidentally delete the app and we have to go reinstall it. And we're always available to do that as needed. And taking this culturally informed approach, we've had really great recruitment and retention in this study. So we did this data in the fall, so we have more at this time, but we had 300 people identify as Latino, provide contact information, and we ended up with a 3-to-1 interest to enrollment ratio, which is consistent with projections based on our prior studies. So we've been really happy with that. And I think this is the most interesting thing, that only 10 people that we've screened have been not eligible due to digital data related issues. Only 1 person has not had a phone, and only 6 people had concerns about privacy with the data. So I think it is very feasible to do this type of research in underrepresented populations, as long as you're really taking the time to provide good informed consent, making sure that the apps you use, that would be a study for a whole nother talk, but the privacy policies, are solid in protecting the participants' privacy as well. And then it is very feasible to do, and it's a way to reach people that we historically aren't able to reach in research by using these ubiquitous technologies. So now I'm going to share some preliminary data. I'm going to focus on some of the keystroke data that we have thus far. So as I mentioned, we're collecting all these data streams, and we're going to combine them into machine learning models. At this point, we're looking at all the individual data streams separately and kind of seeing what signals we're going to find. And with the keystroke data, we have the most analytics done thus far. And we have some pretty exciting preliminary results that I'm going to share with you. So how the keystroke data works, we use KeyWise technology, and the participants just install the virtual keyboard, which replaces the native keyboard on their phone. The keyboard works anytime you engage with your phone. So if you're texting, if you're sending emails, posting on social media, anytime you use your phone, you just type on that keyboard instead. It collects all your key press data in the background. So typing speed, backspace use, autocorrect use, inner key delay, all of this metadata. We don't collect any data on characters or words people type to preserve privacy. And then the keyboard's also available in English and Spanish, which has been important for this population. And it's very easy to toggle between the keyboards in real time, even within a text session. That's also been important because a lot of our participants are bilingual and flip back and forth regularly between the different languages. While participants are using the keyboard, we also engage with the accelerometer during the phone. And we found this is important because engaging with the accelerometer allows us to control further unexplained variance and understand what people are doing while they're typing. Are they walking? Are they sitting? Are they lying down? And it also gives us a measure for fine motor activity as well while they're engaging with the keyboard. And what we've found consistently through various studies using this keyboard technology is a stable and consistent within individual digital phenotype. So this is an example participants typing data from a Monday to a Sunday. And the different colors, you don't need to worry about trying to see them, but they just represent the different times of the day, morning, afternoon, and night. And you see that this person has very consistent pattern of typing behavior over the course of the 7 days, very much a digital phenotype. Whereas this is another person who types mostly laying down, the first person typed mostly upright. And it's a very different pattern, but you see their pattern is unique to them and consistent throughout the day. So in our sample, we have data analyzed thus far for 48 participants. We were hoping to get about a 50-50 split of English-Spanish speakers. We are getting overrepresentation of Spanish speakers in our study. As I mentioned, these participants are 50 to 70, mean age is around 58. We are also getting overrepresentation of females in our study, and about 59% of the participants meet our criteria for mild cognitive impairment. We use the Jack-Bondi criteria from the lab data to diagnose MCI. When we look at their sociocultural data, you can see 92% of our participants were born in Mexico, and that they've been in the United States about 28 years. 86% have a primary language of Spanish, although 80% are bilingual. But we do a pretty comprehensive assessment to determine what language we should be testing in, and we're testing about 86% in Spanish. When we look at their childhood socioeconomic status, we see 56% of these participants grew up very poor or poor. And this is important because when we think about applying our normative data to the neuropsychological testing and to some of these digital markers, childhood SES is a very strong predictor of quality of education. And so this needs to be taken into consideration when we're developing norms and figuring out what to control for and adjust for in looking at this data across different populations. So in our sample, what we see is that typing speed varies by age. And again, this is a bit of a restricted age, but our older folks are typing much slower on average than the people closer to 50. And we're seeing that typing speed follows a diurnal pattern throughout the day, such that people type more slowly morning and evening, and particularly slower in the evening and fastest midday. This is consistent with previous work that we've published in another sample. This was an open science sample of 250 adults aged 20 to 70. We published it in 2020. The open science sample contributed 14 million key presses, and we found the same diurnal pattern, slower morning and evening, fastest midday. And amongst older adults, when we parse the data from the sample apart, particularly, there's a pronounced slowing in the evening, which if you think about potential implications for that, that could be an early sign of sundowning. This diurnal pattern was also replicated by some work by a postdoc I work with, Raymond Hernandez, who's at the University of Southern California. And in this study, he actually used Jason's ambulatory research cognition app. They had 198 participants aged 18 to 75 who completed a 2-week, 5 to 6 times a day EMA and mobile cognitive testing protocol. You see on the symbol search task that Jason just presented on, there's the same diurnal pattern where people are slower morning and evening, fastest midday. And then I think this was particularly interesting. He looked at response times to EMA mood-related questions and found the same diurnal pattern, that people were responding quicker to these mood-related questions midday and slower morning and evening. So we wanted to dive in a little bit more to our data and see if there was an interaction between diurnal patterns, processing speed, and how those differ based on if people are impaired or unimpaired, and if they're lying down typing or upright typing. On the left here, this represents people who are laying down when they're typing, and the right is upright typing. And we see for when people are laying down typing, the purple line here is people who have impaired processing speed, so more than 2 standard deviations below the mean on our neuropsychological battery. The orange is people with unimpaired or above average processing speed. And we see this same pattern in the impaired folks. It's particularly pronounced when they're lying down typing versus upright typing. And the line is a little bit flatter in people who aren't impaired. When we dive in a little and look at these relationships in our risk groups, so as a reminder, we have people who don't have MCI or cardiovascular disease risk, people with one of the risk factors, and people with both MCA and CVD risk. We see that typing speed is significantly slower in our CVD risk group compared to our folks without CVD risk. And when we look at phone jerkiness, which is a metric we can get from the accelerometry data, our MCI participants have significantly less phone jerkiness compared to our people without MCI. And it may seem kind of counterintuitive at first, but if you think about jerkiness as a measure of, activity while you're using your phone, our MCI participants are really just lying down or sitting, typing, not being mobile, whereas our people without MCI are getting a lot more jerkiness because they're typing while they're moving, walking around, being a little bit more active. Thus far, we haven't seen any relationships with backspace use from the keyboard. So in conclusion, these studies to date across various samples are providing evidence of typing speed as a passively and unobtrusively collected digital biomarker of processing speed. And we're seeing this consistent diurnal pattern throughout the day. And the observed effect of this diurnal pattern among Hispanics is consistent with prior work of persons from other ethnic racial groups, which is nice validation for this work. And why is this important? It's important because we really need to establish the utility of digital biomarkers in diverse populations to advance this type of work. And historically, and as a field of neuropsychology, we've done a very bad job of leaving out underrepresented populations in the development of new tests and new technology. And by leaving them out in the development, then our algorithms aren't going to be able to be applied to diverse groups. So it's important to bring the stakeholders in from the very beginning and early stages of development, which is what we're trying to do with this study, to also set appropriate standards for digital biomarker work going forward. So with that, I would just like to thank my lab and our team and all of our research participants. And I'll wrap it up.
Any questions for Dr. Khan?
Thank you for the fantastic talk. I have several questions. First, was there any reason for why the assessment periods were 18-month apart? Second, whether the keystroke app is also publicly available or if it's proprietary? And then third, I was super impressed with your community engagement to get participants. And you said they sounded and talked like participants themselves, increasing engagement and higher likelihood of getting them engaged or to participate. So I wanted to know a little bit more about like the background of those people who are your staff who are doing this engagement. I'm assuming they're not undergraduate students at UC San Diego. So I just want to know, are you matching their educational level and that kind of stuff? Because often community members who are lower SES, they may be a little bit more fearful of interacting with staff who are just kind of too high in terms of their SES. So I was just curious about what your staff looks like in getting such high engagement with the participants.
Sure. So my working memory might be a little slow, so I might start with the back, go in reverse order here of the questions, and you have to be reminded of the first question. So the staff, so we've been very careful in who we choose to hire and engage with. And the full-time staff are all bilingual Hispanics who don't come from a high affluent background. One of our staff members actually still lives in Tijuana and makes the commute every day to San Diego to be in this study. All of our undergrads as well. We're fortunate enough to have at UCSD a program called the Madura program, and it's minority aging. Seeing head nods, you might have this program as well. These are students, and we select Hispanic students who they're underrepresented and usually the first in their family to go to college. Most of our students live down by the border as well, and so have a lot of the same lived experiences as well. About the Keystroke app, yes, it's available. As I mentioned, my disclosures, we've commercialized it. It's called Keywise. You can go to your app store and download it if you want to just use it. Only that the commercial version is only available on iOS. But if you did want to use it for research, we have a different research grade version that's iOS and Android that is available for use if people are interested. And then remind me of your first question. I'm sorry. Oh, the 18-month. Yeah. So because the preclinical changes of ADHD happen so slowly, we just kind of wanted to see how long within a 5-year R1 we could go to get longitudinal visits. So we just kind of settled on 18 and 36 months as something that was feasible. We thought, anything closer in time than that, we probably weren't going to be likely to see changes.
Thanks for a super interesting talk. I had 2 questions. First, are there data available for individuals, in the literature, under 50 years of age, and, thinking of adolescents, young adults, in terms of the types of variables you were looking at, posture and activity during the day and evening?
Yeah, there's been some really interesting work done with younger adult samples, collecting this digital health data. There was one study, I don't remember what university it was at, but it was a college life study, which was one of these first ones where they were collecting all this digital data students went around their daily life, and it was focused on depression. And then there's a group up at Oregon who also has been doing a lot of work with digital phenotyping work, especially for youth suicide risk and things like that. I have another study that I'm doing. We're doing mostly active data collection, so EMA mole testing in a group of young adults down in rural Ecuador. And I'm actually finding, this is the first time I've ever worked with younger adults. It is the most challenging group to keep adherent to the protocol. Our older adults, our adherence rates are so fantastic, and we're finding it a little more challenging in these college-age folks to get them to stick to the protocol.
And then the second question had to do with the content of the messages and the structure of the writing. Do you have data on that, or you're planning to collect data? I'm thinking like the length of the sentences or the content of the messages.
Are you referring to in the keystroke?
Yes. Yeah.
Data? Yeah, so again, we don't collect any content that's being typed, only the typing patterns. And so our brilliant statistician is able to kind of figure out the length of a message just based on some of the timing between key presses and delays between. And he's also able to differentiate if people are typing with one or two thumbs or fingers on their phone, and we can covary for that as well, because that impacts typing speed.
Thank you.
Questions? Okay, we'll move on to Dr. Roque, and then we'll have a general discussion afterwards.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today on a rainy day. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you all some of the work that I've been doing over the last few years as it relates to the study of aging longitudinally. I'll be sharing a lot of the concepts that I think have already been discussed, so if I kind of hit a moment of that, I will maybe skip ahead. But again, thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. My talk is titled Beyond Numbers, and it's really about the human aspect of this work. We are collecting data from humans, and so I just kind of want to ground us in that perspective as we get started. So the agenda for today is to kind of just give a little bit of background by way of understanding who are these underrepresented groups in cognitive research or cognitive aging. We'll move on to a little bit of science about kind of what the data tells us, how we work with this data. And then I'll close with essentially a set of case studies and a set of challenges and opportunities that are in front of us. So with respect to the people, part of what this section is hopefully orienting to is this idea that there are some people that have been systematically left out of aging studies or research in general. And so I'll just kind of make a couple comments about that. First of all, it's important to say that the older population is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. And so as we kind of think about the science that we do, we need to keep this in mind and inform our science by this. So just by way of statistics, between 2022 and 2050, we presume that older adults will take up not only a larger proportion of the population, but Hispanic older adults much more so. And this isn't something that are only in demographic trends. This is now becoming, if you will, a funding priority. So the National Institute on Aging is thinking about this, and so they put out a few statements. I'll just highlight them all to you here. One of the biggest hurdles in research is the recruitment and retention of older adults from underrepresented populations. And so it's a problem worth studying and kind of unpacking. And further, NIA seeks to engage a more diverse range of older adults. And so I'm very proud to say that my colleague, Dr. Munoz, recently got an R21 funded to look at exactly this in midlife. I'm really excited to be a co-investigator to work on this project and to start to answer some of these questions as it relates to more diverse populations. So what I'll go into now is a bit of the science and our scientific thinking surrounding all this beautiful, rich EMA data. So I'll start off with a little bit of grounding with respect to why we decide to collect data intensively. So some of you might have used this figure in your talk, some of you maybe have already seen it, but either way, I'll kind of go through it slowly just to explain the main concept. So in most studies of longitudinal aging, participants are brought in, let's say now, year 1, and then year 2, they come back. Each of those years, we only really see them for 1 day. And so the probability with which we catch them on a bad day at baseline and a good day at follow-up would give us the improper conclusion that these people are improving. Cognitively, it looks like, if you will, the line is going up. But if we have methods like those discussed by Dr. Hassenstab, Dr. Moore, we are able to do this now more intensively in people's contexts to understand, in a sense, this measure of true change. And so if we're able to dynamically model this data, this time series, what we see instead is that this person's actually declining. So you can understand the impact of this for clinical trials, for the study of pharmacologic interventions. It's important to know if the person's actually improving or if the data are leading us to believe that they might be improving. So some of these tasks have already been talked about today, so I'll be brief. If anyone wants to try them out, they are web-based, so feel free to scan the QR code or come up to me after in case you want to check them out. So we have a measure of processing speed where people are asked to compare symbols from the bottom of the screen to the top and make a judgment as to which one's correct. There's a working memory task that's somewhat of a simple one with just colored dots. And then there's also other tests that I don't have enough time to go into today, like tests of relational binding to understand how people bring pieces of information together, like colors and locations. And so this work has been published in many outlets. Recently with colleagues, Louisa Thompson and others, we've kind of put this work out there to say, not only does it work in those with MCI, it works in diverse populations, and people are willing to do this. So again, I'm going to bring up the human aspect more in just a few minutes, but these protocols are feasible. And that's one of the main things that I came here to convey. They're intensive, but people are willing to do it. So now, maybe why are they willing to do it? So we'll kind of go into that in just a moment. But one of the things that was also brought up today is this idea that when we use these methods, part of what happens is that we have a lot of data, and we need to unpack something referred to as retest effect or practice effects. So my colleague, Dr. Zita Oravec at Penn State, has developed this beautiful model along with other colleagues to unpack this retest effect, but on top of that, also extract other meaningful parameters about cognitive aging. So you'll notice the forgetting parameter. That's one parameter that we're particularly excited about because it quantifies from year 1 to year 2 how much was lost in terms of understanding how that task works and getting you back to your performance asymptote on that task. So that paper is published, so if you want to check it out, I'm happy to provide a copy. But it really unpacks kind of where this science could go if we had all this data. And so what I'll talk about next is how we get all this data. And so I'll talk about this from the perspective of a set of case studies. Full disclosure, I'm the core leader for the Technology and Data Management core for the Einstein Aging Study, as well as a project leader for a project looking at air quality and cognition. And so I'm selfishly going to talk about those studies for a few moments here today. So in the context of the Einstein Aging Study, what we've recruited are community-dwelling older adults from Bronx County, New York. These are older adults that are 70 plus, mean age of around 77. And we asked these older adults to come in, participate for anywhere between 1 or more years. Ideally, we want them to come back for all 5, but things happen and adherence is a real problem just in general in longitudinal studies. And so in this protocol, what we ask participants to do is every burst or every year to give us essentially 14 days of data. And within each of those days, we're measuring them 5 times per day. 2 of those assessments, the one in the morning and the one in the evening, are self-initiated. So the participant needs to remember to do this. And so it serves as a prospective memory test. And then there's 3 notified surveys in the middle of the day that if you will, give them a clue, like, hey, it's time now to do this assessment. And so what we have are measures of stress, affective and cognitive health, but we also have these objective cognitive tests that I showed just a moment ago. So this is work that I'm really excited about because this has been ongoing for many years now, and we just got funded as part of this program project grant to do this for 5 more years. So just really excited about the data that we're able to accrue to answer questions like were presented in the section about the science. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to highlight is, this is work that is essentially with a certain perspective in mind. So we're giving participants not only this study smartphone where they complete the EMA protocol, but we're giving them a number of sensors. The one that I'll talk to you today is called the Atmo Tube Pro. It's a measure of air quality. It measures things like particulate matter, so like the particles in our air. It measures things like gases that might arise from candles and incense and hand sanitizer, referred to as VOCs, volatile organic compounds, while also measuring measures of environmental comfort like atmospheric pressure or humidity and temperature. And so over the last about a little over a year or 2 years now, we've been able to amass a pretty significant size data set. So we have about a few million records across about 100 participants that have contributed air quality data. So what we decided to do is see to what extent this participant-provided data aligns with, if you will, expectations that we might see in other weather data, from weather monitoring stations. So all in all, what you see is month-to-month variation depicted in different colors as a function of different indicators from this air quality sensor. So at the top, you have a marker of humidity, and over the course of the study, humidity increased as we stepped into summer. We see these peaks in particulate matter. Turns out those were the days where the wildfires from Canada were impeding New York, and we're able to detect that in participant-provided sensors, which is really exciting. And then there's all sorts of other things going on that I don't have time to get into today, like potential other data that might be interesting for people that study pain. Pain has been found to be related to things like humidity and pressure. And so this is kind of uncharted territory, although very excited to get into that. And if anyone's interested in talking about this data more, definitely happy to talk. And so what I want to do is highlight a couple myths that come up when this work is typically presented, myths about older adults' participation in digital health research. So the first one that typically comes up is, will they? And short answer, and I think it's been covered today, yes, they will. But it's the supports that allow them to get there that I think are most important, and what I'll go over in just a moment. So older adults, at least in the Einstein Aging Study, are willing to comply with a protocol like this. We have somewhere around 80% of adherence over the 14-day period, where people are doing 5 assessments per day. 5 times a day for 14 days, they're taking somewhere around 5 minutes out of their day to do something that we ask them to do. That's a really big deal. And this is both participants with and without mild cognitive impairment. And so, to dispel that first myth, I just wanted to say that. And then the other point that's also salient and important is that we do give participants a number of sensors. So right now we're giving them 3, if you consider a smartphone a sensor, and we're about to give them a 4th, a continuous glucose monitor. And overall, across the sensors that we have access to and data so far, they're compliant on that as well. So that means that not only are they charging it, they're pairing it with the smartphone, they're keeping both apps awake, they're doing a lot of work with us and for us. And so short answer, yes, participants are able to do EMA cognitive assessments as well as surveys. They're also able to and willing to provide sensor data and comply with all the things that come with using that sensor. So we're really excited that overall, this is again a feasible protocol for older adults. And so what I wanted to get to today is this set of important points that have allowed us to collect the data we have. So it's really important to say and reiterate something that was brought up earlier, that these materials are tested. We don't just, if you will, share them amongst us as researchers. We check in with potential participants, past participants, people in the community to understand if our materials are appropriate, if our materials are perhaps encouraging too much burden. And so we get that real-time feedback as we're designing these protocols. And so it's feedback at all levels, and it's all considered to make the protocol we have today. The other thing that's important to note is that we went through a very rigorous effort to ensure that we weren't overburdening our participants. And so essentially what we did to answer that question was ask all of the investigators to do it. A 14-day protocol, 5 times a day, really lets you know how much time you're taking up from participants if you have to do it yourself. And so we did put our protocol into the research investigators' hands, and we learned a lot. It allowed us to make some compromises. It allowed us to maybe remove some constructs that weren't fully interesting or relevant to the questions that we were funded. So overall, we really put some mind and effort into understanding, is this a right amount of questions or should we subtract some things? And long story short, we subtracted some things. The other thing that's a point to reiterate is that we provide strong training to these participants by way of staff-provided training over like a PowerPoint for like about an hour where we unpack everything about the protocol, how it works. We show them screenshots. We give them hardware instructions. We really walk them through the whole protocol before they leave and go home. So we ensure that they have a sense of what they're about to do before they embark on that 14-day journey. We also provide support and follow-up to participants. So we have a phone number printed on a lanyard that participants wear. We have printed materials that we provide. And we also call them. We call them to check in, see how they're doing, see if they've had any issues, and if there's any ways that we can help. We do this early and often. So we check in, I think, on the 3rd day and maybe I think on the 9th day as well, to make sure that there's not something going on that they don't feel comfortable sharing. So we learn a lot from these participant check-in calls, and they really appreciate the support that we provide with respect to using the smartphone or all the other technologies in this study. And I think the most important point here is that we try to create this feeling of community and belonging through shared activities. So our staff has meals with the participants when they come in to do neuropsychological assessments. Our staff checks in and asks how their grandchildren are doing and all the other things that are about conveying the human aspect of the work we do. We check in with each other. We support each other. And that's one of the most important things. But I do also have to say that I think that the most important thing that allows this data to be collected in this process to all work is the amazing staff we have. So I did want to give a huge shout out to someone that we work with named Mary Lou, that's been with us for many years, ensuring that this data is collected, connecting with participants in this very rich, engaged way. So again, huge thank you. None of this would be possible without really great staff. And so what I'll talk about next are a set of challenges and opportunities that come from doing this kind of work. So, you might ask questions like, why aren't we reaching this target population? Or perhaps why won't they comply with our protocol? So I think the most important thing that I wanted to say today is that our ideal data streams as researchers might not be things that participants are willing to do. And so in this study of air quality, the sensor does also happen to collect GPS data if the participant provides consent. And we did have a couple participants that expressed concern about how that data is used, how it's stored, who gets to see it. And so as much as I want to get all the GPS data in the world on these participants, I need to understand that these participants have concerns and they need to be respected. The other challenge that's important is to understand that, we might want to design these very rich protocols, but people are living their lives. They're working, they're taking care of children or adult parents. And so it's often the case that we might have to make some trade-offs or compromises in the protocols we design. I think another challenge that's important to echo from the talks earlier today is that form factor matters, whether it be a smartphone or a tablet, or letting them just use it on their computer if they'd prefer to use a web-based link. We want to be flexible in the options that we provide to participants so that we can maximize the engagement that we get. So some of the work that we're doing now with my other hat of mobile monitoring of cognitive change co-investigator, we're doing this now via web link. And so we're able to message a link, we're able to send it via RedCap or Qualtrics. They don't need to install something. They can have a more interim experience with the assessments that we intend to provide and collect data on. I think another important question to think about, and we can talk over lunch more, is how much protocol burden is too much? If you ask a participant, they might say, I really only want to do this for about 5 minutes today. If you ask us as researchers, we might want 5 minutes every 4 hours. And so it's important to talk to the people that are actually going to do this work to understand what they think is too much, perhaps not what we as researchers think is too much. And then what I'll close with today is a set of data that I collected on Prolific. So I'm going to be talking about that for a few moments, looking at participants' expectations and their willingness and their data privacy concerns as it relates to using this mHealth data. So, the question that I ask as part of this work is, what research protocols are participants willing to contribute data to? And so full disclosure, I also use Prolific. I love it. Happy to talk about that. I'm currently working on a paper that highlights the challenges with using these platforms and perhaps some of the mitigation strategies you can invoke to hopefully fight bots, check where the data and your participants are coming from, and overall have stronger data quality. So more on that later. But one of the amazing things about Prolific is at the click of a button, I can essentially get a representative sample of the United States. And so if I wanted to ask a question like, are my materials accessible across all different racial, cultural, ethnic groups, I could recruit a representative sample and I could ask that question of the data. The same way that if I wanted to, I could also balance as a function of political affiliation or create another type of screening instrument that allows me to more purposely target a separate population. So on Prolific, although there's a small proportion of people, you can recruit people with mild cognitive impairment, and there's probably some challenges and concerns there as well, but Prolific is powerful in that way that you can have big reach, and I think like Dr. Hassenstab said, quickly. So the data that I'll be presenting today was collected over a matter of like, I think 2 or 3 days. So about 1,500 people in about a couple days. So it allows you to answer questions pretty quickly. So one of the first questions I had was to ask participants what types of sensors or assessments they'd be willing to contribute data to. So I asked them to imagine a hypothetical study with hypothetical compensation and ask themselves the question, what are they willing to do? So this is the most ideal case. They don't actually have to do anything. We're not giving them a device. We also pay them to do the survey, but they have nothing to lose. And so they can tell us honestly how they feel about these different types of ways of collecting data. And so one of the first things that we notice is that people are actually interested and willing to do daily cognitive assessments, which is very reassuring as a person that collects daily cognitive assessments. But people are also willing to do other things. They're willing to collect food diaries, medication diaries. But as you get a little bit further out to the far right of the plot, there's things that people are less willing to do, like phone calls and video calls. And so it sounds like they want to do things that allow them to have flexibility over their time. That was the first thing I gathered from this data. Some of these other activities could be done from the comfort of their own home, while commuting to work. They can be done, if you will, a lot more simply. Now, with respect to sensor data, it was a very similar story that not all data streams are created alike. There are some data streams that people have concerns about. So as you'd expect, people are generally willing to use something like a Fitbit activity tracker or a heart rate monitor or an air quality sensor, because those have clear public health relevance. But as you go a little bit further out, you'll notice that there are some other data streams that researchers do collect that are, if you will, low on the willingness score. And so as an example, I also have a past life studying transportation and driver safety. And one of the things I'm really interested in is driver behavior. Turns out people don't want a dash cam looking at them while they drive. The same way that people don't necessarily want whole home real location data as to whether they're in the bathroom or the kitchen or somewhere else. That's really important for people that study instrumental activities of daily living, but people might not want that. And so it's important to keep this in mind as you're designing and thinking about studies, that there is this cross-section of the population that is generally averse to a lot of the things that are really exciting scientifically. And so the other thing that I wanted to convey today is that, again, not all data is created alike, and not all participants feel the same way about how their data can be used. So one question that I asked was, what controls people might wish to have over their research data? A lot of participants want to be able to delete their data. That could be coming from a number of different directions, like I probably did really bad that time, or this doesn't represent me because this was an atypical week because I'm sick or stressed or something else. People are interested in being able to delete their data, which for most IRBs, there is a stipulation about that. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you can say that some people also want to share their data, although it's not many. It's somewhere around 25% of people want to share the data with caregivers, physicians, and maybe even their insurance provider. So it's interesting to kind of see that there's a wide range of opinions about what happens once the data is created. Because that's ultimately, we use the data for science to write papers, to convey knowledge, but this data could have other uses, and it's important to understand how people feel about those other ways we can use the data. So just a little bit further on that point, I also asked people what exact use cases they'd expect their data to be used for and how comfortable might they be. Well, with things like algorithm development, there's a mix of opinions, although it kind of trended towards being more comfortable with algorithm development or developing therapeutics and diagnostics. So people saw, again, a use for the data for public health relevance, to understand a disease, to understand how to mitigate that disease. People are okay with that. But as it relates to external collaboration, you'll notice that there is like a range of opinions. And so it's important as you're working with your participants to be very clear in your consent forms and in your messaging for them to really understand where this data goes beyond the data collection event. It's going to be shared with many institutions. By what means? By what process of de-identification? People are thinking about that. And so it's important to say out loud what you're doing in those respects. I think it's also important to highlight that people almost very clearly are indicating that they want this data to be used only for the original purpose. It's important because a lot of uses that we can foresee for this data haven't even been dreamt of. We have all this amazing data, whether it be screen time data, sleep data, and everything else we've talked about today. And we've not had a chance to mine that data because we've barely just started collecting it. And so there's something here about helping to convey to participants what the future uses could look like and if they'd be willing to engage in that future. And as we can only expect, no one wants to be re-identified. A very large proportion of people said, don't find me. I'm a person of this category, but don't find me. And so I'll close with, I think, an opportunity. And the opportunity is this idea that a lot of us are already collecting a ton of data, whether we know it or not. So I'll just do by a quick show of hands. Have you ever heard of something called Google Takeout? How many of you have a Gmail account? All right. So every single one of you, I encourage you to go to a website. It's takeout.google.com. And on that website, you'll be able to see all the data products that Google's been collecting data based on your endorsement of terms and conditions. For me, I think I had somewhere around 9 years of location data. Apparently, Google knew where I was the last 9 years, to the level of every few minutes, my activities were categorized, whether I was biking, walking, driving, where I was geospatially in my city. And so if you just like endorse the share my data option, that's kind of where this goes. So there's another conversation about that. But what I wanted to convey there is that ultimately this is an opportunity if we not only communicate this appropriately to participants, but it's an opportunity to understand or have a baseline on the people that we're going to study and enroll in our observational studies or our longitudinal studies. If we're going to run a study about mobility and we're about to collect mobility data, wouldn't it be interesting to have, if you will, an informative prior about that person's mobility 5, 6, 7, 10 years back? And so that's an opportunity that needs unpacking. Every time I ask about this in a study, people are kind of unwilling to think about that because Google has other data about them. And so that's what this slide is going to unpack. So in general, assuming that they were aware that this data could be shared, you'll notice that most people are generally averse to these metadata streams. So we're looking at less than 50% endorsement across almost all of them. So these are things like export of all the locations you visited, electronic health records, or an export of your Google search history or YouTube search history. People in general had concerns about these additional data streams that they already are collecting. And so that's something that I think is, I'm quite curious about and unpacking, because I think if we understand that problem and the privacy concerns there, we have a chance of, if you will, ingesting large amounts of data about people's history, essentially overnight. So there's something really exciting about that. So to close, I just want to recap my talk and say, together, us and our participants, we're able to bridge these gaps in our understanding of cognitive aging. We're able to elevate everyone's voice with respect to what they need to say about the aging experience they're having. And hopefully, ultimately, we can catalyze positive change. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for listening.
Any questions for Dr. Roque?
So you guys collect a lot of data. So my question was how do you guys ensure security with your data and your patients?
Thank you. That's a great question. So with respect to data security, what we essentially, do is follow industry standard best practices, things like encrypting our data, things like ensuring the data is only accessed by, if you will, a small subset of people that have a need to access the data. And so we have very tight controls over how and who can access our data. And then to the point of the industry best practices, we typically work with our institution to say, what is the vetted tool that you'd recommend we use? and we essentially use that. And so that allows us to get IT support. We have direct communications with our IT to make sure that not only are we doing that right, but as we think about collecting new data, how should we think about it? How should we think about asking our participants for consent? So we're doing essentially what, if you will, businesses would do. We're translating that to the research context. Thank you. That was a great question.
Anyone else? Say.
Thank you for the presentation. I am blanking on the name of the data collection platform, but that was very intriguing, the speed with which you can collect a large amount of data from many people. I'm not sure if you're aware of I think it's called big data paradox. One example being the recent Delphi Facebook study looking into vaccine rates. Do you have any thoughts in terms of how those types of biases can sort of influence what you're trying to do?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think the short answer is that's something I need to give some more thought. What we end up doing in a lot of these kind of large samples is then decomposing our data regionally. So we do collect things like state or zip code, and so that allows us to, if you will, parse our data and maybe look at clusters that might be apparent. So yeah, I think there's one answer you get if you look at the whole data set, and there might be a different answer we get if we start to kind of regionally divide or cross-culturally divide our participants into those sets. That's a really important question, and I think something I need to give more thought to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roque. Okay. Well, thank you to our speakers. I think all of these presentations highlight that this type of data collection is feasible and acceptable among underrepresented populations, and they clearly show that applying this type of methodology provides a lot of opportunities for measuring cognitive health in an unobtrusive and ecologically sensitive way. But I did notice a lot of challenges that come with this type of data collection that many other studies may not face. For example, there's a need to have a strong community presence, specifically thinking about Dr. Roque and Dr. Moore, and have materials and staff that can present information in the participants' language preference, for example. And so at this part of the session, I'm just going to open it up for questions, but I guess I'll start with the question, and then hopefully other folks have other questions. One question that I have is, and that comes up for me as well, with my work as well, is the scalability of our projects. So how can we incorporate this type of methodology or data collection protocols into larger population-based studies? So say, for example, the health and retirement study or other population studies. What do you think are the ways in which we can do something like this? And you can raise your hand. I can. Mason, or yeah. Yeah, maybe you can just stay seated. Keep it casual.
Yeah, sure. First of all, wow, Raeanne and Nelson, those were like amazing talks, you guys. Jeez. But to answer your question specifically, I think there's a couple of myths, and I think Nelson really touched on this, and you too, Raeanne, about incorporating technology into big studies. I think people think it's cheaper. I think people think it's going to be easy, and it's going to take less staff. And I think all three of those things are untrue. Unfortunately, I really liked how, Nelson, you were mentioning the importance of having people, and doing trainings. That takes a lot of money and resources. So that's probably the biggest limitation to like the scalability question. If you just have a beautiful app and put it out there, there's this wonderful study that came out a few years ago now from someone at Sage, where they looked at all of the available apps that are out there. There was a huge one for Parkinson's disease, and it was like this biggest crowdfunding or crowdsourcing effort like ever done, I think. They got 700,000 people or something like that to sign up for the study. But the median interaction time with that app, I think, was about 1 week, 10 days. And I think they got less than 2,000 of the 700,000 people to even get through the consent form. And then the actual number of people that they enrolled was just like a few hundred. So you can't just have an awesome app and expect people to do all this stuff for free. Like, you've got to give things back, and you've got to have a lot of staff and a lot of people to manage it. That's where we're at right now. That may change in future generations. I don't know, but I think it's the huge challenge.
Would say the same thing. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Coming from someone who's like very interested in how you guys include technology into your studies, I was interested in how do you guys like went through the design process? Like, are you guys designing it yourself and sending it straight to developers? Or are you guys hiring a design team and you're collaborating with these design teams so that it'll make it easier by time it gets to developers?
So I can maybe start there, and I think there's a lot of other opinions on this, but what we typically do is start with something that's kind of like a minimal PowerPoint deck that kind of conveys the flow, conveys the logic of what we're trying to capture, and even then the ways to parameterize our tasks. So we do design our tasks from the beginning with multiple modes of administration, so an easy or a hard version, or a version with, ducks as stimuli versus cats. Like, we have a way of kind of building that in from the beginning. And so typically from there, what happens is that we provide those specifications either as a Word document or a PowerPoint deck to a designer or a programmer. They'll then implement, at least in my use case, like a really strong proof of concept that then as a research team, we can kind of make our rounds with and start figuring out if it's appropriate. So typically that process might take, weeks or months from start to finish. So, recently we've been developing digit symbol substitution tests. So if you've used that before, it's a piece of paper where there's a lot of symbols and numbers, and you have to kind of go serially left to right, top to bottom on this piece of paper. And we're trying to find a way to digitize that. Turns out it's not as simple as just shrinking the paper to a phone. There's more to it than that. So it's both an iterative process, somewhat of a long process sometimes, but it does start, I guess, in our research group with the researcher first conveying the general sense of the idea, and then that gets unpacked and iterated on over time.
I'll chime in a little bit. So when thinking about what data you want to collect when you're designing these studies, as I mentioned, there's about 26 sensors built into smartphones. Just because you can collect all the data doesn't mean you should, right? So, and would you want, I wouldn't want to consent to a study where, they're collecting every single thing I do on my phone every single day. So we take a very systematic approach to what data streams and data do we need that we think are going to, be relevant to our study aims. I also think it's super important to work with industry and use apps that are commercially available, or at least supported, in some kind of way versus building something every time from scratch in-house. Working with industry, there's just so much more support. It's going to be less expensive. There are some great tools available out there. And so there's no need for every research team to always be reinventing the wheel, especially because you're not going to be able to maintain that over time.
It's a really great question. One other thing that we found really, really important is to do user experience research with the populations that we're really interested in. And you can hire firms to do this. It's expensive, but it was incredibly worthwhile for us to do this. When we first started working with older adults, we didn't really understand the technology limitations and attitudes. And, older adults don't like things popping up suddenly. They don't like things disappearing. They need to understand scrolling behaviors. And I'm talking people who are totally smartphone naive. This is less and less of an issue. But as we also moved into intellectual disabilities, that's a whole other contingent of factors that we had no idea about. And so there's websites there's one called, I actually skipped over these slides, but there's these user accessibility guidelines. There's one that's called Web, I forgot the name of it at the moment, but it actually can take you through a checklist to make sure that people with visual impairments can see and understand, people with hearing impairments can see and understand what's going on. But the most important data you get is sitting there as the person designing whatever the test is or whatever your assessment platform is, sitting there with the people and hearing the pain points that they're telling you about as they're using your device or your software. That's like the most important feedback you can get.
You mind passing it down to Shia?
Sure.
Thank you.
So I have a question about the training and explanation process. So for example, when explaining, say, the cognitive tests to participants, I imagine that the cognitive function of participants varies a lot. So probably it takes longer for those with worse cognitive function to understand what those cognitive tests are and what they should do. So I was just wondering, what approaches would you recommend researchers to standardize a training process?
So I think I'll start with just a couple quick comments. I think the first thing that I realized as I stepped into this work was train about everything. Like I assumed that maybe it's just the app that we need them to collect data on, but it turns out even hardware things are really important to train about. So it's kind of starting from, like, if you will, the highest level unit, which is in our case a phone, and then training them on that before we train them on our app, before we train them on our protocol. And so it's about kind of going through many layers of training, at least as far as how we do it. So that means that these trainings could be a little bit long. As Dr. Hassenstab was saying, it involves a lot of staff time and effort. So I think, if I remember correctly, it's about an hour for each participant to step them through everything that we do. We do it, to your point, in a standardized way with a PowerPoint deck. So every participant at least has a chance to kind of step through the same slides. Some participants might have been in the study last year, so they don't need the full re-explanation, but we give them that time if they need it. So we do kind of, don't assume anything, and definitely don't assume even the more basic hardware things. Like, everything is important to train about.
I can just add to that a little bit. So in addition to what Nelson was saying, we also send all participants home with a manual that we've created that has pictures, step-by-step reminders. And then our mobile cognitive testing platform we use called NeuroUX. The test, every time they take a test, there's an option if they want to do a little demo again. And they get those instructions. And so that way, we're not hoping that when they're go through it for the first time in the lab, they're just always going to remember the test instructions. People can skip over it too if they want, but just building very user-friendly. We worked really closely with a lot of user design folks to build these tests, make them user-friendly and easy to do has been important.
One kind of interesting point that you bring up is the time it takes for people to learn these assessment is actually an outcome in and of itself. And we have published a paper on this, and I'm hopefully going to be running a symposium about this concept of retest or practice effects, or just learning effects in general, as a incredibly sensitive outcome for studies. It's proving to be one of the largest effect sizes I've ever seen in a pre-symptomatic disease. So people who have the pathology of Alzheimer's in their brain, but they have no symptoms, are slower to learn. And that slow to learn shows up over and over, and it gets worse over time. So it's actually, you don't want to train people too well, is maybe what I'm saying. But of course, you obviously, with EMA, you've got that retest that asymptotes. And just as Nelson showed on that beautiful figure from Zita's paper, that time to asymptote is a really interesting outcome.
Is this for AAIC?
Yes.
Okay. I had a question for Raeanne, if you don't mind. When you were presenting your work on the keystroke, I was wondering if you notice if there are some participants that don't type much and therefore they don't communicate a lot, and if that could be an indicator of social isolation, for example. Do you get any survey data that can kind of match or kind of let you know about their social lives, for example?
Yeah, sure. So we do have a minimum kind of requirement for typing data that we need. So as part of our screening process, we make sure to ask people if they do type on their phone. Some people only dictate in their phone, and so then we just exclude them from this particular study. But the minimum typing threshold we need is not a lot of keystrokes. So it's about 500 per day, which I'm sure most of you students in this room hit that before you're even out of bed in the morning. We are finding interesting though, looking at the typing data in this Hispanic sample, we get much less than we do in some of our other samples throughout the day, just anecdotally, but we still get enough to meet that minimum. It's just not very much. And you had another question, I think, about that. Oh, and social activity. Yeah, I was also gonna say we're also getting phone use habits data as well. So we get that, on the iPhone. I have an iPhone, so I don't remember what it's called on Android, but your screen time data as well. So we're going to be linking that with the keystroke for also a measure of social activity overall. And my guess is that may be a more sensitive indicator of social activity than just the keystroke data. Actually, I have to give a shout out to one of my former graduate students who's now faculty at the University of California, San Francisco. She and her lab have been doing some interesting work in FTD, just looking at battery life usage across the day, and just how people's battery life on their phone gets drained throughout the day has been a sensitive indicator to differentiating people with and without FTD. Frontotemporal dementia. Yeah. Yeah. So people basically with FTD have, I think and it's more nuanced than this, but slower kind of battery drain. I think they're using their phones much less, for example, than people without.
Jane?
Thank you all so much for the fantastic presentation. So I had a question about participant retention. So I was curious about, so once you recruit these participants, what kind of approaches have you utilized to, continue having them in your research throughout time? And if there were any approaches that were effective, and if there were others that were not so effective?
I can talk about this if you want. This is a huge issue. I kind of famously made this like a big challenge at one of these Alzheimer's disease meetings on a panel to all of my friends and colleagues that are doing the same sort of thing. Like, how do we keep people in studies? Your older adults that volunteer for studies are usually retired, and some of them really love to use technology, and they're like your professional subjects, But I'm really interested in those other groups that we can't reach, or the ones that sign up, install your app, start tapping around, and then they're like, I'm out. I can't do this. That type of adherence question, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we face. We pay people. We use a dynamic incentivization system, which is based off of old school reward theory, where the more you do, the more you get paid, with bonuses, like bonus structure. But that's not viable for, commercialization purposes. It's certainly, paying the customer to use your product, that's not so good. But in clinical trials and stuff, it's like a really effective strategy, and they're the most motivated people on the planet. Like, people with autosomal dominant AD who've watched half their family members die at a young, early age from Alzheimer's, you'd think their adherence in these studies would be spectacular. It's not. It's about 60% for our studies. So the most motivated population on the planet, we can't keep them, and we're interfering with their daily lives, right? Like, especially with EMA. I mean, these people work, they have children, they can't just drop everything and pick up a phone and complete a few assessments here and there. So we've had to sort of customize our messaging towards different personality types and different ages. There's the altruistic motivation people that are just like the do-getters, like, give me a lumbar puncture, take my blood, they're ready for everything, And then there's the other people who are like, I'm really in this for the money. And then there's a certain subset of people who are just like, I love seeing those completion rates at 100%. That's like enough motivation for them. I don't understand it, but that's just, so we have these like subtypes of people that respond to different types of strategies. And I think we need to study this. I think there needs to be a randomized control trial where we actually study different sort of adherent mechanisms and compare them against each other. And that's an R01 I want to write. I just haven't had time to do it. But I think it's one of the most important questions we face.
Thank you. So one of the other things I think I would add there is feedback. So one of my colleagues recently ran a study exactly in that vein, where at the end of the 14-day, maybe 7-day period, there was a PDF given that shows trends over time over the course of the study, as well as comparing their morning to their evening performance. And so participants really found that they enjoyed that. I think, one of the things that we're trying to do with the Einstein Aging Study is figure out how to structure that feedback. We don't want to make it in a way where they're now comparing themselves to a friend or colleague or someone else they know in the study. It should be feedback about them or ipsative feedback. So to Jason's point, I think one of the other things that's its own R01 is kind of the influence of feedback and how that feedback could be structured to encourage or perhaps even discourage adherence. I have some work in that from, if you will, my other past life, looking at cognitive training interventions, and it turns out, health status and health behaviors that are happening in someone's life might also be a marker of adherence. And so the other answer is there's sometimes nothing we can do. If they're stressed, if they're dealing with a loved one that's sick or dying, that's their priority. It's not to be in our research study. And so that's kind of where I just want to say it again, that at least for me, there's a lot we can do, and then there's so much that we have no control over.
I'll just add a couple more things that we try to do that haven't been mentioned yet. So we try to disseminate results as quickly as possible and to actual participants. So on our study website, we try to get data posted and let them know that there's information being disseminated so that they can actually see some of the fruits of their labor, so to speak. And then we just also try to do other things to keep them engaged and let them know we care about them, such as sending holiday cards and the staff will just reach out and check in and, life updates and things like that. And they like, it's hard to keep staff over time, but it sounds like you have one you've had forever, but the consistency of staff over time, if you can have that, that's really helpful too.
Okay, anyone else have any questions? Any other comments? Well, this has been great. Thank you so much, Dr. Roque, Moore, and Hassenstab for coming all the way from where you're from to Austin and joining us in this workshop. We'll have time after, there's lunch somewhere out there. I see it. I see the food. For those of you who are interested in that, and the speakers will be eating as well, so you can potentially talk to them then as well. So we'll break. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you on Friday.